Welcome to the Catholic Theology Show, sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle, a community that supports the mission of Ave Maria University through their monthly donations of $10 or more. If you'd like to support this podcast and the mission of Ave Maria, please go to avemaria.edu/donate for more information. I'm your host, Michael Dauphinais, and today I am joined by Neil Watson, who is an adjunct professor of business at Ave Maria University, as well as the director of marketing.
Yes.
So welcome to the show, Neil.
Thanks for having me, Dr. Dauphinais.
Yeah, Michael, of course, but so glad to have you here. And, it's been great to kind of see you here as somebody who's actually directing marketing and teaching marketing, right? And wholly committed to the Catholic mission and ethos of the university. So you get to wrestle with these questions in practice as you kind of are also teaching them to our students.
Yeah, and it was very important to me when I came here to Ave Maria as director of marketing that I had the opportunity to teach, because it's the same as when I was in industry, right? You wouldn't sell a product that you're also not talking to consumers about, right? And teaching is a great way to be involved, to listen to the students, to understand their experience.
Yes.
But then to also take that practical experience and relate it to them, to provide them with opportunities for internships in the department, but then to also these questions we wrestle with as marketers, as people in the business of higher education, right? To actually have them hear those stories as well.
Yeah, and so let's kind of begin with maybe a 30,000 foot question, right? A big question is you're flying in an airplane you're just looking over the land. And when we think about business, and sometimes there's a little bit of a bias against business within kind of contemporary society, within the Catholic world, perhaps. How would you, and then if there is that, then, marketing perhaps would be the part of business that would seem to be maybe treated with the most suspicion. So why is marketing a good thing? And why, can Catholics be marketers with pride?
No, that's
a healthy pride.
Yeah, that's a great, and I see my students wrestle with this sometimes. I certainly wrestle with it in my own life. This idea that marketing is manipulation. I think especially, again, in the Catholic world, we talk about marketing. There's this idea, we're just trying to get people to buy things or create this demand for products that maybe they don't actually need, right? And it perpetuates and fuels consumerism, right? Materialism. And there's certainly ways that it can do that. But I think at the end of the day, if you think of marketing at the highest level, it's really a service. So if you have people who have problems in today's world, right, and you have products, goods, services that can solve those problems, you have to connect the two somewhere. And that's what a marketer does, especially a good marketer, right? Connects this person with the problem to the solution you have, and then creates the economic opportunity for that to solve their problem. So in this way, marketing really is a service to your fellow man, a service to our fellow human beings to alleviate and satisfy their desires, their wants, their needs, their dreams.
Yeah, and I think that idea of even marketing, right, is simply creating marketplaces, right? And marketplaces are where goods and services are sold and exchanged among, right, people who want to buy and who need services, and then or products, and then people who are making services. And in a way, let's just kind of then again step back a little bit and, right, you also have been very influenced by your study of Catholic social teaching. Catholic social teaching is in some ways kind of rooted in the response over the last 150 years to saying that there's a Catholic answer to, or at least there are Catholic principles that we can hold in place, right? When Leo XIII wrote, in our times, Rerum Novarum, and he, in 1891, and kind of saying, wait a second, we're beginning to see the development of these modern economic conditions that maybe are large, distressing, fast-paced, it seems, and saying that no, communism, though, Marxism is not the answer. That actually, unfortunately, only intensifies the worship of capital.
Yes.
By treating individuals as subordinate to their own good. So Could you just talk a little bit about what were some of the key things that maybe you've discovered, because you've studied this a lot, you teach it. What are some of the key principles of Catholic social teaching, somehow saying there is some kind of there's a proper place of economic life within human society?
Right, and not just economic life, but social life, right? The
Yeah.
heart of CST, of Catholic social teaching, is the idea that we as humans are social, right? And while the church has brilliantly written about this in the most recent papacies and trying to articulate and wrestle with these broader questions of socioeconomic life, right? It goes back. You can see Aquinas already bringing principles of this. You can see it even, in the early writings of the church fathers in the New Testament, right? This idea that man is created in imago Dei. That's probably the first principle of Catholic social teaching, right? Imago Dei, the image of God. And who is God? Father, Son, Holy Spirit. God is community, right? He is social, right? And as human beings created in that image of likeness, we have this duty to be an individual person, right? The human person is always centric as the second kind of principle of CST, but there's always this idea, right, of creating the image of this communal life we have to share in. And the church is very cautious to ever say this particular system is good or bad, or overstretch her limits into, telling a state that this is the best or dictating which economic system is better. But certainly she has a role in playing and analyzing the contemporary situation and offering guidance from a moral perspective, from a perspective rooted in those theological principles that informs her understanding of man, both as person and as a communal being, as a human being.
Yeah, and I think Leo XIII, right, also says that family is the fundamental cell of society. Why is it important that Catholic social teaching also address the family, and how does that also maybe shape kind of our approach to thinking about economic life?
Yeah, I think this is one of the greatest concerns, like you mentioned, at the end of the 19th century and into the early 20th century, when we see the popes engaging with this topic, right? Was the Industrial Revolution changed fundamentally the way family life was oriented. And as all of society urbanized more, and as we saw this kind of move away from a rural agrarian lifestyle as most people's experience of life to this urbanized kind of industrialized experience of life, right? We saw this separation. Work moved out of the house and moved away from the land and into factories, right? And we saw this disconnect of treating those people the same way you would if you owned the property, right? That you were tending to, caring for, developing the land, right? They just became metrics and numbers in the system and on that calculus to profit, right? And this is kind of where the Catholic social thought comes in, of teaching the importance of family, right? At the end of the day, man doesn't live to work. He works so that he can live and provide, right? We kind of flip it and do the inverse, right? So we want to make sure there's working conditions that are respectful of the person, but also respectful of his or her ability to provide for his or her family, providing a just wage, right? Providing just working conditions, time off, right? Is a very important tenet of Catholic social teaching, to be home to the present, right? The role of education, right? We can't even just create factoryized kind of education or commoditized education, right? It reserved for the role of the family as the primary educator, the parents as the primary educators. So you just see that family becomes the underpinning, right? And the more you chip away at the family, the more you're going to see the economic and the social kind of impact of eroding that. And that's where so much of social teaching really comes back to that family life.
Yeah. And I think some people are surprised at this as well, where, say, the church's teachings on abortion, the church's teaching on marriage is part of its Catholic social teaching, right? Is that human beings don't exist as individuals alone. They exist as persons within families, within communities, within governments, and of course, ultimately within the church. And so at each of these different levels, then, you also have somewhat corresponding aspects of work and freedom, that individuals can do things on their own. They can make goods and they can sell goods. Families, in order to have some place that they may not own, but at least they have to have some place to live, to have some kind of temporary access to property through some kind of lease rental agreement or something, so that they can also then own things in common, right, in order to provide for one another. and they can then become centers of economic activity as well. And then, of course, we can then also enter into the broader society and community, whether or not that's factories, whether or not that's working for, a lot of contemporary businesses, that all of these things, and seeing this as like, it kind of reminds me of a Catholic principle, right, is that abuse does not take away proper use.
Correct. Yeah.
Everything that is human will be abused by humans.
Yeah, we have this tendency to just find ways to go towards the wrong direction with the tools we're given.
Yes, yeah, we do end up with dysfunctional individuals, families, communities. Our individual parishes are going to be mildly dysfunctional, right? Everything that we touch, and yet, right, I think one of the things that the church encourages us is to say, wait a second, find within it the proper use. And the church helps us to speak to that. It says, if you properly understand the nature of the human person, you will begin to see, well, within family life, there's a proper use. There's a health within the family. There's a health within a business community, right? There's a health within a society. And I think it was C.S. Lewis in his address to workers one time, he says basically like, Christianity gives us the courage to try to improve society and economics and these sorts of things, but it also gives us the courage to make it through when our efforts to improve things don't work.
Yeah, there's that sense of enduring, persevering through it, right? And of meeting society where it's at too, but always trying to improve and bring your individual contribution, right? And I think that's where, again, we can paint with broad brushstrokes and say business is bad, profit is bad, right? Economic systems of any kind are bad, but the reality is, as human beings, we need these systems, right? We are ordered. We need senses of orders, of tiering, right? And we can't escape them. So how do we participate in them with the best possible intent? And not that they are our ends, but as a means to our ends, our ultimate goal of being saints in heaven, right? And so that's a beautiful quote again of sometimes you have to grin and bear it and persevere and do your best to change it with courage.
Yeah, so there are a couple lines from the Catechism I thought were maybe helpful. One is that it speaks about, in the treatment of kind of Catholic social teaching, economic activity, it says that, right, human work proceeds from persons created in the image of God, that like because we're made in the image of God and exercising dominion, the work we do is actually somehow noble. It's a duty. Quoting Paul in 2 Thessalonians, right? If anyone will not work, let him not eat. Assuming, right, he's capable of it. But so work somehow honors the Creator's gifts, as it puts it. That work, it quotes, it says, can be a means of sanctification and a way of animating earthly realities with the Spirit of Christ. So this, I think, and maybe it's helpful just to step back and kind of come up with what is the vision of human labor and work within the teachings of the church, that it can somehow be, and the quote even says, even in its hardship, which we encounter a lot of hardship in our work, that this is actually a way of sharing in, right, in union with Jesus, the carpenter, and the one who was crucified on Calvary.
Yeah.
Right. So tell us a little bit about maybe some of your own studies, some of the, church's teachings on this kind of vision of work as a gift, right, and not as a punishment.
Yeah, it's hard sometimes on Monday morning to get up, have that cup of coffee, and say, I'm going to go to work today. It's going to be sanctifying, right? Mondays don't always feel the best, and we get to Friday and we kind of celebrate. But if you have this perspective, again, that even God works, right? And in the creation story in Genesis, we know, right? God makes, he made. There was nothing, and he creates from nothing, right? There's this idea that in some way he is working and at work, right? And created in Imago Dei, in the image of God. We too need to share in that. I think it's always helpful on my worst days of work to remember that there was work before the fall, right? The fall, original sin does not make work appear, right? There was still work we had to till and keep, right? And it wasn't until after fall that becomes, we say toil, right? And then you get this change kind of in our relationship with it. So I think there is something that in work, there's kind of from the fall, and the Catechism talks about it, a lot of CST talks about it, right? Original sin distorts some of our understanding of these, right? But that doesn't mean the principles aren't there from the beginning, and with God and rooted in God. And I love that quote from the Catechism about, Jesus as carpenter. Sometimes as Catholics, we immediately think of the crucifix and Calvary, right, when we think of the suffering. But I love to picture kind of that secret hidden life of Jesus, in that, like, before his public ministry, he was a carpenter. He was just serving his community on a local basis, employing the trade Joseph, his father, gave him, or his earthly father gave him, to create, to make, to earn a living, probably to provide for his mother, right, in that society. So that work was sanctifying, and we can unite it ourselves and our labor to that same action of Christ as redeeming perpetually in the world too.
Yeah, I've been, grateful to be influenced by St. Jose Maria Escriva, the founder of Opus Dei in the 20th century. And he, I think, just kind of recovered and helped spread that mission of that sanctification of work, that work in ordinary life, like our family life and everything, can be a means of really encountering Christ. And that it is, again, in a certain sense, work, family, these are blessings. And now that they've become also toil and difficult, that too is actually where we can meet Christ, in the failures, in the sufferings, because, right, the good news of the incarnation and Calvary is, of course, that we're not alone in our sufferings. But I did want to jump to another theme. So if work then is if man's created to work, right, work's not for man, but man is not for work, as you put it, but work is for man, then it also means that, like, we ought to somehow have the ability, like, we don't need the government's permission to work.
No, and then
right?
CST talks about, right, there is a right to work, a right to labor that government should not impede, that private enterprise should also not impede. So.
Right, yeah, and I say 24, 29, everyone has the right of economic initiative, contributing to the abundance that will benefit all. He should also, of course, try to use this right to economic initiative with an eye towards the common good. So maybe could you talk a little bit about how it is that if we have this, we're created to work, and this is an aspect of our lives, then we have this right to economic initiative, or this orientation to economic activity and economic life, that the government then ought to facilitate. Could you maybe, are there some key encyclicals where the popes talk about this over the last 150 years?
Oh yeah, the popes in several encyclicals address this, right? Laborem Exercens, right? And then we see it come out.
And what's that one? Just would you, is that like, that's like the 1991 on the dignity, of work, right?
Yes,
by John Paul II.
By John Paul II.
Just for maybe readers who may not know it,
yeah,
would you say a word?
Laborem Exercens is right, again, towards the collapse of the communism, right? So it's always important when we say Catholic social teaching, put it in the context of the time, right? Most Catholic social teaching has, rooted in theology, has overarching implications, but usually the Pope, the papacy, is addressing a particular concern at a particular moment in time in history, right? So a big part of the timing of that was understanding, right, as these two competing ideas of West and East, of capitalism and communism, kind of dominated the conversation, right? What were the moral merits of each system, and what was the right system, if you would? And again, the church is very cautious never to say capitalism is good, right? Communism is bad, right? And even in writings, they always just explore the merits, the good of this and the bad of this, right? Here's how it can be good. Here's also where it's most likely to go off the rails a little bit, and where original sin will start to corrupt it, right? So it really addressed this idea of the right to work, right? And the wrongness of a government to interfere in your right to work and to use your gifts the way that God created you as an individual, right? So not just a right to work, but a right to work in the way that utilizes your gifts and your unique experience as an individual, but directed towards the common good, right? So that's that balance too of a right to work. And then, of course, too, in the encyclicals and the teaching at that time is the right to private property, right? And the church reaffirms this idea that if you have a right to work, then at some point that means you also have a right to some sense of private property, right? Because you're owed wages for that. It would be unjust to give you a right to work, but then to withhold the wages or to just refund all the wages directly for the common good, right? So at least at some point you have to have this property, this privateness of property that then you can use at your discretion too. And so it's where the church really starts to see, again, the coming together of these ideas of, work as a right, but then this right to property that also creates, right? And then your ability to then direct that towards the proper ends, which again is not, let me have a right to work and private property so I can just hoard it and build it up, right? But to use for the common good, right? That's the other key principle of Catholic social teaching, this idea and sense of common good. So the dignity of the individual human person, but always directed towards the common good.
Yeah, and I think that is also one where, right, that within that idea that the church, right, as it puts it here, right, rejects the totalitarian and atheistic ideologies of right, communism or socialism, and the sense that the abolition of private property is inhuman because it takes away this just natural orientation of the human person to be able to work. No, it's really fascinating. And what I want to do in a moment, I want to come back and I want to how do we take these principles then and like consider the world of marketing specifically? But maybe before we do this, just to give, members of our, those who are watching or listening to this show, just tell us a little bit about your own story. How did you get interested in your faith? How did you get interested in becoming a marketer, right? How did you get interested in teaching it?
Yeah, so I have one of those less exciting Catholic stories where I was born a Catholic, I was raised a Catholic, I stayed a Catholic, and I am a Catholic. And so, the Catholic faith has always been a part of my life. And I was very blessed to be raised by a mom and dad that, prioritized our faith life and raised us in the traditions of the church. When I had the opportunity to go off to college and study, I actually chose to study entrepreneurship. So my undergraduate is a bachelor's from John Paul the Great Catholic University out in San Diego, right, and focuses on entrepreneurship. And I think it's a great one to explore the role of entrepreneurial business when we talk about Catholic social teaching, because again, back to Imago Dei, right? What does God do? First, he creates, right? And an entrepreneur, what is an entrepreneur doing? Creating, right? Yeah. Bringing economic activity, bringing value to society by creating something new, whether that's a particular expression of something that already exists, or a completely new product or development, new brand, what have you. It's very creative. So that's where I really started getting interested in how can this intersection of faith and theology, and of course, growing up in the time of John Paul II, who wrote so much about this and brought CST to, a whole different level. And if you say, if all the popes before him were kind of turning up the volume, JP2 just kind of really cranks it up when it comes to Catholic social teaching. And then, of course, when Benedict XVI comes out with Caritas in Veritate, right, this is very formative time in my life as I'm studying business and first starting to practice business. I created my own business at the end of my sophomore, senior year at JP Catholic, and then had the opportunity to continue studying business at Catholic U. So that's where I did my graduate studies, was at Catholic U in DC. And that at the Bush School in particular is where so much of this came to life for me, right? Studying with Dr. Bella and others, Stu McKay, around this business as a force for good, right? And you could take these CST principles, right? And they're theoretical, right? They're kind of abstract, but you can make them concrete and really, truly apply them. And so after finishing my grad studies, I went into industry. And so I worked for TaylorMade Golf. I spent many years at Adidas, and then eventually at Tillamook Creamery, the ice cream and cheese brand. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And during that time, again, trying to apply CST as best I could in those environments. But there's always kind of this nagging of like, there's a way you could direct this even more, right? And help develop the next generation. And that's where, when the opportunity came to Ave Maria, I couldn't pass that up. So that's how I arrived here today.
That's great. That's great. Could you, is there maybe one story from, that's kind of in TaylorMade, Adidas, Tillamook? Yeah. Tillamook. Maybe is there one story from of kind of something you did within marketing that you felt was kind of like meeting some of these, where you felt like you were making a contribution in a way? Because I think sometimes we kind of imagine, I did this thing where we were marketing Mother Teresa, and instead of no, what I was able was to make a process work better and, it was we were able to meet our quarterly goals. I mean, I don't know how to put it, that like the soil is not bad. I have this idea of, Father Matthew Lamb, who was one of the founders of the program here, would often say the higher does not negate the lower. And that's the whole beauty, is that God's power does not negate creative activity. And so we don't love God more by loving creatures less. We love God more by loving God more.
Yeah.
And so we don't need to denigrate human activity in order to love God more, right? We just need to we need to raise divine activity more. But are there any kind of things that you would say maybe that you did that you felt were kind of were good and noble just on their own terms?
Yeah, I mean, working for Tillamook, the last place I worked in industry before coming to Ave Maria, was, we make cheese and ice cream, right? And there's this, at a human base level of needs, people need to eat, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, yes, you can make cheese, and cheese is cheese, right? And once I started working at Tillamook, learning why the quality of the product matters, right? Why do we, I say we, but why does Tillamook age their cheddar, for instance, in 42-pound blocks instead of 600-pound blocks, right? Because it creates a more consistent product. The cheese in the middle of that smaller block is going to be more like the cheese on the outside than if you age it in a 600-pound, right? And you learn all these nuances of the product, of the people working the line, right? The importance of the kind of salt you use, the quality of milk, right? How many, what are the protein structures of it? What is the health of the cows and the herds producing that, right? And you start to learn that, wow, it's not just cheese is cheese is cheese. It's cheese, and you're not just feeding people with cheese, right? But if you make a good product and you can tell that story, right, of the people, right, the farmers that are treating their cows right, of the workers on the line putting this extra care into cultivating this product and transforming it, right, all the way through the supply chain, through our relationships with the retailers we work with, right, you could start to see all these places where even if we wouldn't, Tillamook wouldn't necessarily express it as we're doing Catholic social teaching, right? You can start to see where some of the principles still come to play, right? This idea of community, right? And for the common good. The whole business was founded as a co-op of these farmers coming together because it made more sense for them to pool their resources to create this brand and this identifiable product, right? And that was more advantageous than them competing against each other on their own, right? So they could still have some level of independence, maintain the ownership of their farms without having to sell them, but they could actually collectively pull this together for their common good, right? And export their product and bring it to market collectively as a whole. And so I think participating in that brand in particular, I saw a lot of these, I had an opportunity to bring them to life in a way that, again, it just reiterated the beauty of the teaching being expressed in an actual practical real business.
Yeah, and it's one of those nice things too, I think, to remember that, right, businesses are collections of human beings. And so when you're serving a business and helping a business grow, you're helping human beings have jobs and have employment and and kind of like function and connect. A lot of our communications are often going to be within our business worlds. And these are, again, kind of like, these are good realities.
Yes.
They may not be the highest, but they're not the lowest, right?
Correct.
We want to kind of defend them. So now I really appreciate you going through that. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, I want to dive a little bit more into thinking really about marketing and what the church teaches about how do we understand kind of some distinctions within kind of marketing that is kind of proper, and then maybe some of the errors into which marketing can fall. So we'll be back in a couple moments.
You're listening to the Catholic Theology Show, presented by Ave Maria University and sponsored in part by Annunciation Circle. Through their generous donations of $10 or more per month, Annunciation Circle members directly support the mission of AMU to be a fountainhead of renewal for the church through our faculty, staff, students, and alumni. To learn more, visit avemaria.edu/join. Thank you for your continued support, and now let's get back to the show.
It's been great to hear you kind of walk through a lot of these principles of Catholic social teaching, how, right, human beings were made as Genesis tells us, right, in the garden, so to speak, to work and till and keep the land. Also, of course, to marry and be fruitful and multiply. So you have the principles of work, family life, even kind of, this kind of common social life that are all kind of, they're part of our perfection within this created world. And then we take all those and we enter into the Sabbath of worship, right, with our Lord, with God. And yet, of course, as we see in the rest of the story, we see, of course, sin enters, relationships become disruptive, relationships with ourselves become disruptive, relationships with the land, with work, with one another. So we also have a great experience of often suffering, exploitation, our own, right, kind of disordered affections. I think as Paul speaks about in Ephesians 4, he calls them deceitful desires. We think we want something, but when we get it, it doesn't make us happy, right? So this is kind of us as we are right now. And in the middle of that, right, the church also says, wait a second, but economic life is still good. Married life is still good, right? We can, in just ordinary work, in the ordinary events of every day, we can somehow do something beautiful that can become a means of sanctification. So let's talk then, because I think you were mentioning, right, that kind of marketing itself out of all of business seems to be the one that people have the most suspicions about.
Yeah, I would say especially in Catholic circles, right? Like, okay, if we say business can be good, right? Economic and participating in socioeconomic life can be good, then maybe the finance people, the bean counters, okay, that's good. It's a little more logic, right? As Catholic, we love things that rational, right? You're going to apply that to accounting, right? Or to the finances, right? Of the management structure, right? Of just organizing people, again, fostering social life at work, understanding your relationship and your team's relationship, right? But we get to marketing and there's always this kind of like, ooh, isn't that just manipulation, right? This is what we hear a lot, right? Marketing is just manipulation. We're generating demand. We're creating demand for products and goods and services, and it fuels materialism and consumerism, right? And so there's always kind of a natural hesitancy, I think, for Catholics in particular, to see the good of marketing, to see that marketing is also a way of participating in the divine life if you do it well.
Yeah. Now you teach a course in marketing right here at the university. And so obviously your course on marketing is going to have some of the principles that would be within any marketing course, I would assume, and yet is also going to be within the world of Catholic social teaching. And you were sharing me a little bit that there was even a Pontifical Council that's wrote about, right, ethics in advertising. Would you want to, share some of the things? I think you have the students read this as well.
Yeah, so we take quotes from it in my class. It's formed a lot of my research here, but again, it comes in the late 90s, and it's from the Pontifical Council for Social Communication. So again, this idea that not only does the church instruct about communications, but also social communications, right? And within that broad field, advertising is something that, especially at the end of the 20th century going into the 21st century, the church had a lot of concern for how is advertising a social communication and done well. And I think we have a tendency again to think of all of the wrong that can come from advertising, right? And the document certainly addresses that, but the first third of the document is spent and actually entitled "The Benefits of Advertising," and it's the first place the church starts when talking about marketing and particularly about advertising in the field of marketing. There's all these benefits to humankind that come from advertising and marketing.
Would you maybe what do you think are 2 or 3 benefits that we might identify as kind of goods that are genuinely contributed by marketing to our common life together?
Yeah, so the church lists several in it, but the 2 I always love to pull out for my students is the first one, which is in the economic benefits of advertising, but the church document says, by informing people about the availability of rationally desirable new products and services and improvements in existing ones, helping them make informed, prudent consumer decisions, right? So this is, again, advertising plays this role of we know our fellow man has problems in the world, right? He has needs, right? The base need of needing to eat, right? But there's these other needs we also have as human beings to be social, to grow in virtue, right? And if you can have a product or a service as a business that meets that need, and you don't communicate to that person, right? You're letting your brother, you're letting your sister in Christ suffer without that, right? And so advertising in particular makes known to them when it's done truthfully and honestly, and the product, of course, is inherently morally good, or at least morally neutral in its use. It'd be a disservice to not advertise, right?
Yeah.
It'd be a disservice to let your brother or sister suffer without saying, we have this good, this product, this service that can alleviate that can help you, fulfill that desire and achieve and solve that problem you have in your life.
That's good. And you mentioned that was the first one. What's the second one?
Yeah, so the other is the cultural benefits of advertising. And I think this is where we get the most kind of, as Catholics, thinking around what cultural benefit. And certainly there's a lot out there that is not beneficial to culture, to society. But the church writes here, advertising can itself contribute to the betterment of society by uplifting and inspiring people and motivating them to act in ways that benefit themselves and others. So there's this kind of, even as just a cultural phenomenon, right? And as we look at, the advent of social media, right? And there's this element that you can contribute to a betterment of society just by creating advertising that inspires, right? That kind of calls at that desire to be great, that tap into that magnanimity as humans, and offering products and services that help them achieve that. So
that's great. So this idea that in a way I was hosting a philosopher who was here, and I was asking him to kind of go through talking about what is nature, what is human nature, and he went back to like kind of just the basic idea that all natures are a striving for something. You see this even in the nature of a tree or the nature of a alligator, or but the natures are always a striving for something. There's a movement, maybe to food, to reproduction. But then when you get to human beings, you get all that. But then you also get movements to play, movements to creativity, and so it's part of our nature to grow, not just physically, as it is, say, for an alligator. They keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger the longer they live.
Especially the ones here.
Yeah, exactly, in Florida. But but this idea that that's actually we need to want to grow.
Yeah.
As again, and whether or not that's artistically. Poetically, just socially, that it's fun and proper to build more things, to train more stuff. I don't know how to put it, to whether or not that's like domesticating more animals or organizing more fairs and festivities, and all the different ways that this would happen. That's actually, we somewhat need to be stimulated by others. We know this, of course, can go wrong, right? Yeah. But in a most natural way, there's something rich there. I like the way. Could you say a little bit more about that sense of magnanimity? Because I think that might be a word that maybe some people aren't as familiar with, right? How is that sense of maybe having a great soul, being big-hearted, is actually a good thing on a kind of social, maybe, a personal, a familial, a social nature, and kind of that actually encouraging that in other people can be good.
Yeah. So magnanimity comes from that Latin root of just great soul, right? And it's about that idea of inspiring others to have, right? We created in Imago Dei, right, means being created in the image and likeness of God, right? We're not created in the image of likeness of any other part of creation, right? And we are called to participate in this divine life. So that's a great, wonderful calling, right? And if you're timid or shy or approach that with too much trepidation, right, it can change and alter the relationship you're supposed to have with God, which completely fundamentally changes and alters your relationship with your fellow man, right? If I can see in myself this calling to be like God, right, towards others. And if I can see God in them and their calling to be like God, right, this should inspire us and really push. And I think business has a particular way and particular expression, and marketing in particular, of being able to do this in a really culturally relevant and kind of a culturally phenomenal way.
Okay. No, that's really helpful. So I like that. One is helping. So first is just stimulating economic activity by connecting people who want products or need products and products that are being developed and sold. And then also just more broadly, trying to kind of uplift and inspire people to become better versions of themselves and maybe just do something different, like kind of that, it's as simple as going on a vacation or something, just to get to experience a part of life that maybe they haven't done yet. Now, in a paper you gave recently on this, you speak of the Hugo framework, Hugo. So, and you say this is a principle that we can use to kind of identify when this is proper and when this is getting unhelpful. Like when this is actually, I need to turn away from that kind of advertising, either in generating it or listening to it, right? That I have to also we have to be really thoughtful, not only about what kind of marketing we do or advertising we create, but also what marketing and advertising we accept. And so this Hugo, Hugo, you call it honest usefulness and growth occasions. And I think it actually shows up because, right, I think one of the popes, is it Pius the 11th, who speaks about those crafty men, right? Who, I think this is in Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years. So this is in 1931. But he basically says, right, he mentions these crafty men who, wholly unconcerned about any honest usefulness of their work, do not scruple to stimulate the baser human desires. And when they are aroused, use them for their own profit. So there's also, right, this sense of these crafty men that go around unconcerned about the honest usefulness of their work. So, of course, then I think I love the way you pick up on that. So then honest usefulness turns out to be one thing that we can identify. And then you also speak about like these occasions of growth. So could you just, walk us through a little bit about what these two are and how they might help us kind of guide and shape some of our own decisions?
Yeah, so they both come from Quadragesimo Anno, and then the second, that idea of occasion for growth, comes from John Paul II and Centesimus Annus, right? Yeah. Both, one on the 40th anniversary, one on the 100th, right? They're continuing to build on this tradition that's existed in Catholic social thought. But the idea there is, again, whether you're consuming advertising or consuming marketer on the consumer or customer side, or generating it, right? We can kind of take these as two axes and try to understand how well are we achieving those ends of our communication, right? Are we being first honest about the usefulness? So what is our product good meant to satisfy? And this, again, isn't just on that basic need of, you're hungry, I have an apple, right? But I have a particular kind of apple that satisfy a particular kind of hunger, right? Or why an apple might sound better than an orange. So it's not just about that base level, but how is this useful to you as a full human and in your fullness of your humanness, right? And then the second axis being that occasion for growth, directing it towards how will the possession of this good or service help you to your ultimate end, right? It's not just about possessing the thing to possess it in and of itself, but it's about possessing it to use it as an occasion of growth for you, right? And not just of economic growth, right? We have to be very careful of, it's not just about possessing that property or that thing to grow economically, but to grow as a full human person, right? In Catholic social thought, we use integral human development, human flourishing, right? These are what we were talking about, that magnanimity of soul, again, that we're trying to facilitate. And so the idea is kind of with this framework, you'd be able to look at an advertising piece and kind of weigh its goodness for you, right? What I tell my students and my team is not, we don't want to just make good marketing. We want to make good marketing that is good. Yeah. And so it helps you understand that a little better and approach it on that, those kind of two dimensions.
Mm-hmm. Now, maybe what would be some examples of things that are, I don't know, where we fail in honest usefulness. I mean, I think we can easily imagine where you just see the, kind of as Pius the 11th pointed out, and that basic idea is that just, you arouse desires that people don't need. And then when you inflate them, right, it's like, that you create a kind of illusion of success, illusion of wealth, these elements, and you try to like play on the person's insecurities. You sell beauty products by making, kind of making everybody appealing to the natural, this kind of deficiency. And yet, of course, right, one of the things that makes human, I think even Aquinas says one of the things that makes human beings like unique among animals is that we alone wear like beauty products.
Right.
Like,
we
so
have this way of adorning ourselves.
We
right?
adorn ourselves.
Yeah.
We brush our hair. We cut our hair. These are things we do. We put on colors on our faces in different ways. So again, these are not intrinsically, but so what might be an example though, just so people can kind of identify where you see like, wait a second, this is not meeting the standard of honest, right, use.
Yeah. So
or usefulness, and maybe another thing where you kind of say, wait a second, no, this is really not meeting the standard of growth, occasion of growth. And, I understand, like, I'm just asking for your opinion.
Yeah.
So it's not the official teachings of the church or something, but what are some examples where at least maybe, or in your own life where you've discovered that, wait a second, I'm not going to participate in that kind of, I'm not going to read those ads or watch that ad or those sorts of different things.
Yeah. So in our research, right, and working with my students and with others, right, we start to see certain product categories tend to play into different levels on that spectrum, on the spectrum. So one of my favorite, like that, where I'd say tends to be deficient, again, painting with broad strokes here, in that honest usefulness is cologne commercials, right, or perfume commercials, right. First of all, in advertising through a screen of any kind, you're not gonna be able to actually show the honest usefulness of a particular scent, right? Because that medium is just deprived of that product you're trying to sell, right? But I think even if you go to like the magazines that have the samples, right, it's not usually the best version, or by the time you get to it in the doctor's office, or where it's lost some of that kind of true representation of what that product might smell like, right? And when you look at the imagery that we tend to use, or that tends to be used by those products, right, very little to do with smelling better, right? It's people who are wearing, inappropriate outfits on yachts, or just, a guy and girl dance, right? Totally out of context. There's nothing about the product itself and why it would be useful to you to smell good in any situation, right? And you also tend to see in those, right, kind of towards that other side of occasion for growth, right? They tend to not show that smelling good is good for you in society, right? It plays a benefit to, as wearing cologne might be respectful to the person you're meeting with because you don't want to offend their scent or their sense of smell, right? It tends to be the selfish desires that get expressed. It can make you look good. It can make you feel powerful. It can make you feel, sexy and seductive, right? So those would be kind of a group of ads that generally we see more on that lower end of the spectrum, right? Then you have examples that meet the other side. So one interesting case study we looked at recently was for the 2024 Olympics. Nike did this ad campaign called "Winning Isn't for Everyone," right? And it played during the Olympics often, and it really showed, again, their honest usefulness of the product. They showed basketball shoes being basketball shoes, and they showed different sports products being good at doing that. So they were honest about the usefulness of their product in that sense, but the script was so heavy on celebrating the viciousness of certain attributes, right? And almost glorifying some of these vices that could come about in being a sports player, that occasion for growth that they could show, right? Of why athletics is good to build virtue, right? Build discipline and lend itself to a magnanimous soul, right? They do the exact opposite. And so that occasion for growth is next to zero on the scale that we looked at, just because, again, you're encouraging the use of that product to build these vices actually instead of virtues. And
so maybe those are both for us as, it seems like, everybody's constantly bombarded with advertisements now. That is the first thing, is just, wait a second, am I learning something about the actual usefulness of the product, or at least in its claims? And then if I were to engage in that product, will it help me become a better version of myself? And sometimes that's fine to say, yeah, it actually does. Like, if it might be a little bit more fun, if we, I don't know, like if I do different things, kind of this idea that I'm using the word fun or like play, because there's not a sense in which human beings have to be, have to kind of like be minimalistic about every pleasure or enjoyment. There is kind of an abundance. I mean, there's nothing wrong with a certain kind of restraint and minimalism. And obviously, I think in a contemporary world of hyper consumption, we do need to kind of err on that side. But still, that we don't create kind of a vision of the good life that is somehow separate from our actual lives, but that, I think, it reminds me of Father John Riccardo often quotes, he quotes Joan of Arc, but she says, I was born for this moment. And, and I feel like we have to kind of say we were born for this moment in kind of where we are, 21st century, somewhat, late forms of, capitalism that are probably less grounded in the vision of the common good of the human person. And which is why then they tend to threaten walking all the way into kind of communism or socialism. And right, we live in hard times, and yet at the same time, well, if we could find God at any time, we have to be able to find God now. And our time is not unique insofar as it's stopped God's ability to interpenetrate our world. And so we can somehow bring Christ into this particular moment, these particular businesses. And even if they're, in a lot of ways kind of imperfect or, at times even half silly or different things,
I think it's so important. Again, so much of Catholic social thought was developed and articulated by John Paul II, just again, where his papacy falls in human history, but just the length of it as well. He sees this vast and rapid change in the communication technology that's available, and why I think he stressed so much this new evangelization. And I think business certainly plays in that, but media and advertising and our change, right? We shouldn't always just pine for an old way, or let's go back to only books. Let's go back to all these things, right? God puts us in history at this particular time, this particular moment, knowing that he's giving you the gifts to use it in that moment, right? The economy he places you in, right? The socioeconomics, corrupt as they may be, right? Or as broken as they may be, he knows that when he creates you and puts you at this moment in history. And this is your opportunity to make use of your grace that he gives you to participate in society at that particular time and place, and with the tools of society as it is being experienced at that moment in human history. Yeah,
and I think we will. We don't need to denigrate or become merely critics of merely criticizing our society isn't going to draw us closer to God. We need to draw closer to God. Yeah. And then as we notice things within our society, right? But we don't need to, I don't think it's helpful to become hateful or disdainful of the whole socioeconomic world. I think that's actually a very dangerous attitude. So it's like, we need God, we need a savior. And, the modern political economic world is not it.
Yeah.
And therefore we do have to evaluate it and judge it in light of the good news of the gospel and the creator. And yet at the same time, we can kind of, we have to develop kind of an affection for our own times. If we can put that, it reminded me at least of Jesus. I think it's Luke 9:22, but he says, he looked at them and they were like sheep without a shepherd, and he had compassion on them, right? So, we are getting to the end of our time. Is there, I'd like to kind of just maybe ask you 3 questions, and then if there's one final word you want to say about Catholic social teaching or your course, you're welcome to. But what's a book you're reading?
So right now, I'm actually going back through the 3rd edition of Catechism for Business and preparing for some more classes. It's a great kind of compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church that's edited by Dr. Bella and Capizzi up at CUA around how do we pull out certain aspects of Catholic social thought and apply them directly into business.
Yeah.
So that's certainly on my bookshelf right now. And having just moved to Florida recently, there's a book called The Gulf, which is about the making of the American Sea. So just trying to learn more about the social and economic development of this beautiful region I now get to call home.
That's great. And listeners may find we had an earlier episode of the Catholic Theology Show in which I hosted Andrew Abella on business and kind of Catholics in the business world. So what's a spiritual practice you do on a regular basis to draw closer to God?
So one of my favorites that we started a few years ago with my wife and children is playing louds and Vesper every morning, and starting the day with morning prayer and with evening prayer with the liturgy of the hours and the liturgy of the church, right? And it was a struggle at first, especially with our little ones, to get them into the routine of it and in our own way to also build that. But we were really inspired by this idea that you can take spiritual practices and prayer life and fit them into your life, but there's this beauty too of orienting your life around the prayers of the church. And so starting our days as a family with louds and ending it with Vespers has become something that's really inspiring, and just, again, drawing on so much scripture into our life that way as well.
That's great. And what's a belief you held about God that you learned was false? And what was the truth you discovered?
I think for me, I love and meditate often on the idea that we are called to share in the inheritance, right? I think, growing up, you tend to, as a child, right, have this childlike relationship. Paul talks about this too, right? As a child, when I was a child, I thought like a child, I acted like a child. And we tend to see this relationship with God of like, if I do good, then God will do good to me, right? And there's this sense of I can merit my salvation in some way. And I think it was really revolutionary to me to discover that you could never merit that salvation, right? And your love for God calls you to act in a certain way, but that idea that we are not just saved, but we're made into children of God, we share in the inheritance, has really altered my identity as a Catholic, as a Christian, and just as a human. And particularly when I pray the Our Father now, to really own those first two words of the prayer.
So as do you have a final word about Catholic social teaching you wanted to share? And then maybe could you say a word about where, viewers or listeners might find more about your work?
Yeah. So there's so much that can be said. It's hard to go through it and distill it down, as I'm sure most guests on your show find. The beautiful thing about Catholic social teaching is so much of it is available for free just on the Vatican website. You can go to vatican.va, and all the encyclicals that are, form the pinnacles and form the pillars, rather, of Catholic social thought are available for the whole world without cost, right? As long as you can access them.
Is there maybe one you would suggest as maybe the more accessible or more helpful?
I love to start, and it's more theologically profound, but if you can wrestle through it, I think Caritas in Veritate is just a beautiful articulation of so much of the principles of Catholic social thought. So not just through one particular lens, but this idea that truth in charity, right, informs the basis of all Catholic thought. That's great.
And that's Benedict the 16th in 2000.
2007, 6, 7,
right around there. Right, it was early. So, well, that's great. And where can people find out more about Neil Watson at Ave Maria?
So you can find my faculty page. It has my email there on avemaria.edu, as well as then connecting with me on LinkedIn as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Excellent. And thank you for listening to us today. As I said, if you're interested in this topic, we do have other episodes related to Catholics and business with Andrew Abella, as well as the church's relationship to political life. So I hope you will find those enjoyable as well. And if you enjoyed today's show, please consider following us on our channels or podcasts. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's episode, please hit the like button and subscribe to the Catholic Theology Show. Thanks, and God bless.